against her?
Well, you know, in this country, the voters decide, but the candidates are nominated by the two major parties, as you all know, which of course limits the leadership choices. But tonight, our dueling panels are back, Allison, taking on this very topic of how do you solve a problem like, well, unpopular leaders.
Okay, so we have to set the clock for
Yep.
4 minutes. We each are going to get 4 minutes, and we're going to see which panel can come up with the spicier answers about this.
This is not going to be like that show where a horrible ending comes to the end, right? There's no death coming. Okay,
No, there's
great.
a slime. There's a huge bucket of slime that will fall on one of our heads if we don't deliver in the panel. That is true.
America, which person do you think will be more upset if her hair gets messed up? All right, let's begin with my panel here in Washington, D.C. Will Jawando is a former official in the Obama White House. Susan Glasser is CNN's global affairs analyst. And Miles Taylor was chief of staff, former Homeland Security Kirstjen Nielsen. Okay, guys, here's the clock up there. So tell me, the idea here that we have unpopular leaders is just foreign to us out the gate, right? We don't have that problem here, right? Everyone loves our leadership. Your eyes are coming out of your head now. What's your sock?
I worked for the most popular president in the United States. Honestly, most popular there's ever been. Yeah, we know about this. Yes, we know about unpopular leaders. We know it all too well, but why is this the case? Why do we have unpopular leaders winning? I'm just going to go straight in. It's because of how hyperpolarized our electorate has gotten, and both parties have tried to lock in their gains, gerrymandered the hell out of the map, and now it's just harder and harder for non-extremists to win elections. So the pitchfork fringes are making decisions for 90% of America. 10% is making decisions for 90%. The result is that the sensible center has been left out, and our democracy is increasingly becoming uncompetitive. That's
so is England a blueprint? I mean, we've left it, so we know it's not what we wanted for our government. But the idea of getting rid of our leaders in that fashion, we tried the impeachments, doesn't work.
Well, you know, if it was our system, we might have more leaders than Great Britain has had, and they certainly have been cycling through them pretty rapidly. The problem is, in all these countries, they're cycling right back to the same old unpopular leaders. They could end up right with Boris Johnson all over again. In Israel, they could end up with Benjamin Netanyahu all over again. We could end up with Donald Trump all over again. Yeah. So what's amazing is that they're unpopular, but that somehow doesn't knock them out of politics, whether it's in our system or in a parliamentary system.
The popularity, though, is subjective, right? Because Donald Trump, for example, he got millions of votes. He's not universally unpopular.
But he was very unpopular. Let's be clear. He was the most unpopular president in the history of Gallup polling. He's the only president in the United States who was never supported by a majority of this country for a single day when he was in office.
Well, you know, I think there's this popularity. It's like a painful popularity, I would say. Like, if you think where it comes from across all these leaders, particularly, I would say, I don't think it's an equivalent on the left or the right, by the say. I just say that. But on the far right in particular, you have people that are peddling fear and division, appealing to this kind of populist moment of wealth inequality, of people suffering, of changing economies, of factory jobs leaving. And I think that, unfortunately, is part of this mix. I mean, I think if you had less inequality, you'd have less extreme, unpopular, popular, painful leaders.
You call it the pitchfork fringes. I wonder, you know, in jolly old England, they are a little bit more fluid at their parties. They tend to abandon the parties more frequently than we do here in the United States of America, where they'll be a little bit more policy and position oriented. Is that the future? We have a lot of red, blue, purple states popping up and thinking about it. Is that the real way to approach this?
Look, I think right now, and I'm very biased in this regard, I think right now is probably the most viable moment for third parties in American history. It's why Andrew Yang and I went and founded the Forward Party, is because we see right now the electorate, a sea change in the electorate. 50% of Americans, for the first time in U.S. history, and since we've had polling on this, say they're now political independents. They're not Democrats or Republicans. 25% say they're Democrats, 25% say they're Republicans. And even of those Democrats and Republicans, 2/3 say if there was a third party, they would vote for it. There's been a change.
Last word, Susan.
You know, I like to say that it's all driven by policy, but I feel like the last few years in American politics have reinforced that it's actually a team sport, and that it's much less about policy than we like to think. Policy is not the reason that Donald Trump became the leader of the Republican Party.
Fascinating. And look at the timing. Alice, I'm going to hand it back to you and try to top that. I don't know if you can do it.
Well-
how's New York looking?
Well,
Oh,
we're
and
worried.
There's the ding.
We're worried here because we feel like the Trump impression might have given you guys the advantage, okay? So we're going to see if anyone here has an impression that they're going to bust out like Miles did, okay? So set the clock, please, for 4 minutes. Oh, okay. They said it. Don't set it. I have to introduce my panel. My panel here is John Miller, CNN's chief law enforcement and intelligence analyst. Jim Walden is a former federal prosecutor, and journalist Mara Escampo is here as well. Oh my gosh, I'm running out of time. I'm burning daylight. Okay, Mara, we have presidents who make bad, unpopular decisions. Why can't we oust them?
I would like to start by saying I do a very good British impression that perhaps could counter what we just heard, but I'm going to leave that out.
Liz Truss, I like this.
Leave that out of
I like
this conversation. So, the systems are structurally very different. So it's not necessarily apples to apples, but there is a lot that we can compare and take from what we've seen here. I think the big thing is, and we have heard this mentioned, is this extreme entrenched polarization. Liz Truss's undoing was that she lost the support of her party. But what we've seen here in this country is that the polarization is so entrenched that you take something like January 6th, where even those who were eyewitnesses to what took place did not demand accountability and tell the truth about what happened because the consequences would be too severe. As we saw with Liz Cheney, you see the same thing with voters. The polarization is so deep. You remember Donald Trump saying he could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and not lose support. His support never went below 35%. Truss's was 10% last week.
That's one of the mind-blowing things, Jim. Their own party, her own party decided that they didn't like the decision they had made. Can you imagine that happening here?
I can't imagine it, but if you think about, everyone's talking about the polarization. Why are we there? We're there for two reasons and two reasons alone. Because the Supreme Court allowed too much money in politics, and because it's not a crime to use disinformation to win an election. If you lie or give misleading information in lots of different contexts, we call that fraud. But you can do it in an election, and it's masked as First Amendment speech. You add that to social media and then incredible amounts of money in politics. That's why there's tribalization. So you want an idea?
Yes.
Let's solve those problems.
Okay, I like that. You know how we've been solving problems, John? If somebody makes a decision that we don't like, we have an insurrection on the Capitol. That's what has recently we've decided as Americans, that's how we're going to fix the political system.
Which is the one thing that we and the rest of the world looking towards us thought could never happen here, at least since the original. So, I think if you look at the politics of it, we have seen in our generation that every president is an answer to the last. If Bush was an answer to Clinton, and Obama was an answer to Bush, and Trump was an overreaction to Obama, and Biden is could we just have somebody who operates like a normal politician for 10 minutes while we sort this out? We're seeing that. But as Jim pointed out, in the background, you have two factors that's really skewing our ability to get leaders, which is one, years of gerrymandering of congressional districts and elections where you have literally taken a country that's divided it and sorted those divisions out so that they are very stark. And the social media factor,
Yes.
Which Mara pointed out, which is truth, not a requirement, constant 24/7, and the conversation has become very damaged and skewed.
And if I could just say, to build on John's point, because I think it's the right one, we talk about gerrymandering, it's really election rigging. That's all it is. And it's not one party. The Democrats did it in New York, and there were 2 court cases to overturn the maps. It's happening all over the country. We're turning into an election country of cheats.
And also, Mara, one last thing. We do have an impeachment process, but we never remove anyone after it. We have exhaustive impeachments, but nobody gets removed.
Well, removal and changing leadership in the UK is much different because it's a different process. But
Lickety split.
Lickety split. It's much different. We've seen that happen now twice in the last, 2-3 years?
That's it. The bell signals that we're done. Okay, Laura, thoughts?
For whom the bell tolled. That's all I say about it. Say that right now. You guys were good. I was intrigued the entire time. I will say, Mara, I do want to see the impersonation. I gotta tell you.
Can you
of the
give us?
British
Can you
accent.
just lay a
Yes.
few
I do
British-
want to have it.
Hold on, Laura.
Because I won a contest when I was 13 years old. It was a British accent contest.
Okay, go ahead.
I'm setting the bar very high. I would like a spot of tea, please.
Well done. Well done.
I would like to know.
It's
I
so-
would like to know where this contest was, and I would
Yeah.
like to have.
It was at my
entered
summer
I would have
camp.
lost.
At your summer
here you
camp.
go.
I mean, well, that's there's no higher accolade, I feel. That is very well done, Mara. Thank you.
Summer camp to CNN. I'm here for it all day long. And up next, there's the really interesting and the men. More and more men and boys are struggling at school, at work, and in life. Men are dropping out of the labor force in historic numbers, frankly, and they're less likely to graduate from high school and college. They're much more likely to have fewer strong friendships today than even 30 years ago. And men account for 2/3 of so-called deaths of despair, dying of suicide and drug overdoses. We're back now with Will Jawando and Susan Glasser, and joining us to help figure all of this out, Richard Reeves. He's a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution and author of the new book of Boys and Men: Why the Modern Male is Struggling, Why It Matters, and What to Do About It. Richard, I'm really glad you're here. I want to get one thing straight. Before you came on, we had a British impersonation. We
Sure.
apologize for that.
Yeah, I think the apology will be accepted in due course, a century or two, but this is my impersonation of a British person. And so I would rank your previous guest as maybe a 7 out of 10, but this is a 10 out of 10 British accent.
Well, I'm here for it, and I welcome you here.
Thank
and I
you.
also welcome this book because I'm a mother of a little boy, and I often think about, my son will say things like, Mommy, because he's only 9 years old, why so much girl power? What's that about? And I kind of think to myself, wow, in the interest of trying to really empower and embolden our young girls, which I really want to do, I often wonder as a mom, is there something leaving him behind in his young mind, not understanding the whys?
We have this really powerful new script for girls and women now, which is a very different one to the one we had even a generation ago, which is about empowerment, education, economic independence. And so we've handed this new, very empowering script to girls and women. And like you, I'm all for that. But what's the new script for men? We've also torn up the old script for men, which was about traditional breadwinning and so on. That's also gone. But we haven't replaced that with a new script for masculinity. And that creates a dangerous vacuum in our culture. We have to create space, I think, to take seriously the real problems of boys and men, which you've just alluded to, and continue to focus on the remaining problems of girls and women. We can think two thoughts at once, and we can worry about two groups at the same time. And I'm very troubled right now that our mainstream discourse isn't taking some of these problems of boys and men seriously enough.
So what are some of those problems? I note that the idea of walking and chewing gum at the same time, we are in Washington, D.C. That might be very antithetical to where we are at times. But I do wonder, what are those struggles? Because there may be many who look at this and say, really? You've had, centuries of being able to be maybe dominant by design. So why should people care, and what are those issues?
Well, I think, first of all, it's happened so quickly. We've seen the economic rise of women, which we have obviously said is a great thing. But what that does is it means it's very hard for us to catch up with what's happening on the ground. And so if we look at college graduation rates, for example, there's now a bigger gender gap in the percentage of women getting college degrees compared to men than there was in 1972 when Title IX was passed, just the other way around. So 50 years ago, men were 13 percentage points more likely to get a college degree. Now women are 15 percentage points more likely to get a college degree. That's a very rapid change. And I think, honestly, it's quite hard for all of us to catch up with that. And then, as you've mentioned, the men who are in the labor market, many working class men and black men especially have been hit very hard by economic trends. So most American men today earn less than most American men did in 1979. That's a very important economic fact that we need to take seriously as we think about what's happening in our culture. And it leads to all kinds of other problems in health, as you've referred to, 3 times higher suicide rates, in the family, where we see a rise in fatherlessness and men not being able to be in touch with their children. So it has these social, and I would add political consequences if we fail to take these problems seriously.
I think in your book, Will, about your 7 fathers is the book, right? And just thinking about how you view this and the notion of boys and men being left behind really in the pursuit of equality, it sounds like.
Yeah, it's really a unfortunate confirmation. I worked in the Obama White House on My Brother's Keeper, and at the time there was a big debate of should we even be having a program focused on black men and boys? And I think this data bears out absolutely we should. And that doesn't mean it's to the exclusion of anyone else. But if you dig into the data in the biological science of brain development, for example, boys and girls have different levels in times of brain development. Boys being a little slower as far as certain parts of their cortex that help them make decision making and all those things. And so our strategies should respond to that. But to the point, and I think it's a great point, this change has happened so quickly And it's been a good response to toxic masculinity. But what does it mean? So in my, my 7 Black Fathers, I talk about the expansion of the definition of fathers, these men who weren't all my biological fathers that stepped in and helped keep me on track. I think we have to figure out better solutions, mentoring programs, different supports that address these unique needs of boys and men across the demographics while we still address girls and women.
Susan, I wonder, can this all happen without coming at the expense of gains for women?
Well, I think that's the great fear, is that we have tended to see these things in zero-sum politics. And of course, at this moment of incredible dysfunction, right, and you have a long history going back decades, really, to, the idea of pitting those seeking better equity in our society against each other, rather than understanding, where they're both affected by common crises and where they're not. And I think that's something, like you, I'm the mother of a son, is something that we all have to be invested in. And I think that part of the problem is we have, to your point, Richard, this toxic politics. And let's be honest, like, we've just been coming through, a number of years in our society where we have had acting out of literally the most toxic form, a caricature of masculinity in our national politics. What kind of message does that send to boys? Talk about, we used to talk about old-fashioned values, right? That was one party that used to say it was in favor of that. Well, when did we teach our sons to be sore losers? I mean, come on. I
completely agree. I think what's happened, absent a better conversation about this and polarization, there's been almost a celebration of an adolescent form of masculinity, a kind of acting out, a sort of middle finger kind of masculinity.
And by the way,
on the right,
my
especially.
son went to an all-boys school, and I spoke with the head of school about this, and he said you would not imagine what it was like to be the head of an all-boys school during the Trump presidency. It was a disaster for boys.
I can imagine, and this book is of boys and men. It's really fascinating. Allison, I want to bring you in here in your panel as well, because it's a fascinating conversation, just given this dynamic at play in politics and our sociological world as well. What are you thinking?
I mean, I think it's a really important conversation, and it's really troubling. So let's bring in our panel. We have John Miller with us, Jim Walden, and Catherine Rampell is joining us. So, John, this is heartbreaking. I think it's heartbreaking to hear all the ways in which men and boys are struggling in terms of school, in terms of the workforce, in terms of their earnings, in terms of their identity, in terms of they're more susceptible to depression, I think, and substance abuse. I've seen this with my own friends. My guy friends struggle more than my girlfriends, frankly. And so what's going on?
Well, I think a few things are going on. I think Richard's work on this has been brilliant, though. When you look at how many men have departed from the workforce as compared to women, but also they departed to where? Not just unemployment, but higher death rates, higher suicide rates, but interestingly, higher rates of addiction to things like opioids. You're seeing changes in men's place in society. If you take a look at the jobs of my father or his father's time, there's not that many coal mines. If you take a look at the auto business, how much of an assembly line is robotic now? How many men have been displaced as women have been entering the workforce?
And there's fewer manual labor jobs, which obviously men filled.
So there's that. But, there are other dynamics which we have to think about, which is how many men got by in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s as mid-level executives who were only vaguely competent, who were great buying a beer, after work at the bar and terrific at their golf game with the boss, who have been replaced by a growing pool of women executives and managers who are just better at the job. And those are the X factors.
Yes, and that raises, I think, two important questions, Jim, which is basically everybody needs a purpose, right? And men and an identity. And so obviously that is being challenged for men. At the same time, are men just sort of naturally less adaptable? I mean, culture has changed. Things have changed. Women have had to adapt. Is there something that men are not adapting to?
Well, I think there are a lot of men that aren't adapting, but I think that I take a little bit of a hard-hearted approach to this. I mean, to Laura's point, women have been discriminated against in our society and in our world forever. and there's still major discrepancy between women's pay and men's pay. And so, I mean, obviously, on the mental health stuff, that needs to be taken seriously. And Richard's points and some of his proposals are really interesting. But when it comes to the economics and the education, I think we should be celebrating the fact that women are making strides.
Yeah, but why does it have to come at the cost of men? I mean, like Susan was saying, why does it have to be a zero-sum game?
Well, from the data that I read, a lot of it was men staying where they were and women improving. And that, to me, sounds like something to be celebrated, not something to be bemoaned.
Catherine, tell us.
I think a lot of this has to do with sort of a post-industrialized economy. So as we've been talking about, these traditionally masculine, male-dominated industries like manufacturing, like coal mining, have declined. And meanwhile, the industries that have shown among the biggest growth are sort of traditionally pink-collar industries, nursing, other kinds of healthcare jobs, services. And for whatever reason, men have not adapted to that. These are also jobs often that require more post-secondary schooling, by the way. You know, you need a degree to become a nurse, for example. You didn't necessarily need one in decades past to work in an auto plant. So, you know, the challenge is, even though there are more men who have entered nursing, it's still a very female-dominated field. These are still very good jobs. They're still very much in demand. How do you encourage a different vision of what it means to have a sufficiently manly job so that there isn't sort of this aversion to positions that are increasing, that pay well, and that men don't seem to want to go into? Or does it require a different kind of socialization of boys, for example, so that they have the greater emotional and social skills that are valuable in many of these jobs, I would say, of the future, but frankly, of the present? So a lot of it has to do with these economic forces that have changed. For whatever reason, men, have become more demoralized rather than adapting. But I don't know that I put the blame on the men themselves necessarily, so much as the role models that they have. And what we are teaching boys is a laudable, strong man ideal to aspire to.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if we're still teaching boys that. I mean, I think that obviously our culture has changed, but I mean, that was traditional. So what's the solution? If we all agree that toxic masculinity is bad or uncomfortable, I don't know a lot of toxically masculine guys. I mean, we all can spot them in a crowd, like at every party, there's that guy. But what are we replacing it with? And I think that, I read somewhere that like honorable masculinity, like we need to give them something. We need to give them a role. And what's the solution?
Well, I'm going to have to talk to Don Draper about that and say, like, where do we get from where you started this in terms of pop culture? But I mean, I had COVID. My nurse, my first nurse was a man. I credit him with saving my life. And he wasn't what I was expecting. I worked in the boys club,
You
the
sure did.
NYPD.
You sure did.
And, my last commissioner was a woman of color, which the place had some adjusting to do towards.
And did they adjust?
Sure they did. And, I think these shifts are a big learning curve. I think the neurological piece needs study because we have to figure out what that really is. And Richard teed it up.
Yes, and so I think that he will tell us what the solutions are. Laura, what is the answer here?
Well, it's so fascinating. But let's bring in the author of the book we're talking about. What a really thought-provoking topic. You and I were talking about this, Allison, but I mean, hearing all the responses, the way people are thinking about it, I mean, it's a little bit mind-blowing. Richard, what is the big takeaway that you want people to best understand from your incredible book?
The key thing, I just want to underline what Susan said, which is that it's not a zero-sum game, even though the politicians try to pretend that it is that we can continue to work on behalf of women and girls in the many areas of society where that's true, but also these troubling areas in health, education, employment, where boys and men are really struggling. Because unless we take those problems seriously and we take responsible action in the education system, in the labor market, then you can be sure that other people will benefit from the problems that boys and men have. So as a culture, as parents, as school teachers, let's take this problem seriously, because if responsible people don't address these problems squarely in the face, then irresponsible people will exploit them. And I think that's the point we're at now. We can have a grown-up conversation about the problems facing boys and men without abandoning any of our commitment to women and girls.
Really fascinating.
Yeah, it is. Just kidding. That's what some parents at this middle school see. A sophomore in high school painted this lovely mural with animals and hearts and all of this nice imagery. And the parents believe that she sort of put in hidden coded messages that read to them as gay pride and bisexual signaling and witchcraft and Satanism.
And by the way, she won an art contest, right? It wasn't that she didn't just go to a playground and just start painting. She put it up there after winning something, and she says, quote, she put up her artwork up there to make people feel welcome. That's not what I'm a part of. That's not what I'm trying to put out there. It's pretty unbelievable to think of the reaction that she's gotten. I mean, she left, I think, a board meeting in tears because of how it was being received. And it really just goes to show you, Allison, I think in so many respects, that it's almost like people are looking for an issue and looking to think that everyone is somehow trying to indoctrinate children or that every symbol is supposed to be nefarious and problematic. This is an example of that. I believe that people are going too far, pushing this notion that our children are exposed to secret signals.
Either we're living in a crazy conspiratorial time, or she did do something subversive and put in some sort of like Easter eggs, like Taylor Swift does in her songs. And maybe she did sneak in some symbols, but I don't think that it's because she's into witchcraft and Satanism. I mean, she was trying to, paint this very like inclusive, welcoming mural. And the fact that the parents ganged up on her at that school meeting and left her in tears, and she was, quivering, said, I was just trying to make people feel welcome. It's gone crazy.
I mean, I don't see the symbolism they're talking about. I'm just not seeing it. But I will say the school did decide to leave up this mural, Allison, but she's going to make some small changes because apparently there was an original pitch from the student that they had pre-cleared, and they're going to now change it to make it look exactly like that original pitch. But that does also mean, Allison, that the LGBTQ flags on the shirts, which is one people had a problem with at one point, will stay as they were in the original.
The hand there, which is, the hand of God in some Middle Eastern cultures. And so they don't like that she put that in there. So that has to go. And then there's a mask somewhere, and I couldn't find it. I've studied this mural before we came on. There's a mask somewhere in there that they think means Satanism or something, and that has to go. But, if you can't find it, I'm not sure the message is really getting, it's not having the desired effect if we can't find it.
I mean, this kind of reminds me, remember those old highlights magazines? You had the hidden figures and trying to find things in there. That's what I have to do tonight.
Hammering Democrats on crime, claiming that liberal-led cities are unsafe. And they're going after everything from sanctuary cities to progressive prosecutors to cashless bail initiatives. But our friend Ron Brownstein has a new article in The Atlantic titled, What's Really Going On with the Crime Rate? And he writes about this new study from researchers at the liberal think tank, the Center for American Progress. Quote, countering conventional wisdom, the study found that homicides over recent years increased less rapidly in cities with progressive prosecutors than in those with more traditional district attorneys. It also found no meaningful differences between cities with progressive or traditional DAs in the trends for larceny and robbery, end quote. That reinforces another study earlier this year from centrist Democratic group Third Way that found the murder rate was higher in 2020 in states that voted for Donald Trump. Back with me now to discuss, we have John Miller, Mara Escampo, and Catherine Rampell. Wait a minute, John. I thought that progressive cities like San Francisco and Portland, Oregon were, hotbeds of crime right now. That's not true?
I think it is true. I mean, if you look at the places that have the most progressive district attorneys, Philadelphia, Chicago, Los Angeles. I mean, violence is off the hook in Philadelphia, off the hook in Chicago. But I also think that the studies are missing something. One, when you go by percentages and we don't see the raw numbers, you can't tell if crime was 68% higher in the city because they had 10 murders that year and it went up by a small number.
Are you saying that you reject the premise that you do think that places with progressive leaders are more crime infested? Or, I mean, because that other study about the red states where Donald Trump won, I think we have a CDC map. So there of the 10 states where where murder is the highest are red states where there's not progressives in charge.
So I think that if you look at who did the studies and how the studies were done, they had the answer before they did the study. I think when you have to put in
Oh,
all
yeah,
those...
that one was the CDC about the map of the highest murder rates.
Okay, but I think if you look at, you have places that have progressive district attorneys. In New York, we have 5 district attorneys. Some of them you would say are progressive, some of them you would say less so, but 35 states implemented criminal justice reform laws that took DAs who would have otherwise been not progressive and made them progressive because they were literally legislated out of entire categories of crimes that would have been prosecuted. So I think the studies needed to be broader. I think Brownstein's writing about the studies was smarter than the studies because he quoted people outside the studies who said much more research needs to be done in this.
Yeah, well, I do think the one thing it does speak to is the difference between the narrative and what the facts support. And, the narrative is that these progressive policies are so overly woke that they're destroying cities. But when you drill down and you actually look at what a lot of them are saying, I don't think most people would have a problem with them. You're talking about things like trying to reduce the number of juveniles being tried as adults, prosecuting police officers for misconduct, trying to reduce cash bail. And cash bail specifically is a very big problem because it's estimated that up to 70% of people who are currently in county and city jails are just there because they cannot afford bail. They have not yet been convicted of anything, and 43% of those people are Black. So I think when you drill down and you look at what's actually being proposed and enacted in these cities, they're not really things that a lot of people would have problems with. And so because crime is so multi-layered, I think that saying, well, it's these progressive policies, of course, it's a very simple sell and it's a very simple thing for voters to buy because it's easy to say someone's soft on crime. That's why you're seeing all this crime. But I think it's much more nuanced than that.
But I also think the narrative, at least, Catherine, is that things aren't being prosecuted. So there are shoplifting things. There's obviously a homelessness problem in San Francisco. Not that that's a crime, but that there's a feeling of lawlessness. There's a feeling that police have backed off, or they're not getting the support, or things aren't being prosecuted.
I think it probably has become a lot more difficult to become a police officer in the past couple of years for good reasons and bad. I mean, there are some things that they should pause before doing, like shooting an unarmed person, for example. And, there's probably also somewhat of a chilling effect on things that would be helpful for them to engage in. But I think part of the issue here is that this is a lot more about perception and kind of vibes. And it is true, crime has gone up across the country. But if you look at the cities that have the highest murder rates, it's not San Francisco, it's not New York, it's like St. Louis, a number of states in the South have red states have cities. They might have a Democratic mayor, but I wouldn't necessarily call them like a bastion of bleeding heart liberalism, progressive, let's let out all the criminals kind of mindset. But there are a lot of parts of the country that I think are perceived as being the more dangerous areas, but that doesn't actually match what the crime stats show. It's not that we want more crime in any of these places, right? I mean, that's not good. But I think a lot of this is really about perception. And it's about, to some extent, scaring the people who don't live in those places rather than convincing the people who do. I mean, like, I hear from friends of mine I live in Manhattan. I hear from friends of mine who live in Westchester who ask me, like, isn't it really scary to be in New York right now? I'm like, no, there are more homeless people, but no, I'm not terrified walking around. There are parts of the country I would be probably scared about.
But I think when you get right down to the numbers in 2016, 2017, 2018, New York City had the lowest crime in recorded history. We had under 300 murders in a city of 8.6 million. We had.
And then what changed?
What changed was we had sweeping criminal justice reform that was meant to address a number of the problems we brought up, which had already been solved here. We had the lowest incarceration rate. We had the lowest number of arrests.
So you're saying they overcorrected?
They overcorrected, and the physics of politics has always been, for every action, there's an equal but opposite overreaction. And now, we go through a year where murders are up 38% and shootings are double, and people are scratching their head as academics, pretending to wonder how this happened. That's how it happened.
Laura, I know you've been listening to this conversation.
It's fascinating. I mean, the idea here, perception being king, one of the things that creates that perception, of course, are the narratives. And people hear things over and over again. They believe that there is some iota of truth, and then they run with it. Speaking of inertia, I mean, things that are in motion will stay in motion until they are disrupted. And